Ladies and gentlemen, I am Lady Lilith, and welcome to Eerie Embers. Whitechapel Murders and Jack the Ripper. One of the first challenges you encounter when attempting to chronicle the Jack the Ripper crimes is determined by the exact number of murders that can be attributed to the infamous killer. The figure most commonly cited is 5 victims, but this number stems from a statement made in 1894 by Melville McNathan and is far from definitive. The Whitechapel Murders file, which includes the actual Jack the Ripper crimes, lists 11 victims. This collection of cases comprises individuals who were definitely killed by Jack the Ripper, others who might have been his victims, and several who most certainly were not. Thus, the true number of Jack the Ripper's victims remains a subject of debate and speculation among historians and investigators. The 5 names most frequently put forward as the victims of Jack the Ripper are Mary Nichols, murdered on the 31st of August 1888, Annie Chapman, murdered on the 8th of September 1888, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, both murdered on the 30th of September 1888, and Mary Kelly, murdered on the 9th of November 1888. These victims, often referred to as the canonical 5, are wildly believed to have been murdered by the same hand due to similarities in their cases, including the brutal nature of the attacks and the proximity of the crimes in both time and location. The Whitechapel murder file also lists 2 victims who were murdered prior to Mary Nichols, whose body was discovered on August 31st, 1888. The first of these victims was Emma Smith, brutally attacked in the early hours of April 3rd, 1888. Emma Smith's tragic ordeal began when she was assaulted by a gang in Whitechapel. She sustained several severe injuries, and despite the efforts of medical professionals, she succumbed to her wounds at a London hospital. As a result, Emma Smith's name became the first to be recorded in the Whitechapel Murders file. However, it is almost certain that Emma Smith was not a victim of Jack the Ripper. Before her death, she was able to describe her attackers to the doctor at the hospital, identifying them as members of a local gang. This crucial detail suggests that her murder was not linked to the infamous Ripper, but rather to an indifferent, but equally tragic, violence prevalent in the area. On August the 7th, 1888, the body of Martha Tabram was discovered in George Yard, a grim alley off Whitechapel High Street. Her murder was a brutal and violent affair, marked by 39 frenzied stab wounds inflicted upon her throat, chest, and abdomen. Martha Tabram, also known as Martha Turner, remains a contentious figure in the annals of the Whitechapel murders. The question of whether she is the victim of the notorious Jack the Ripper is still debated among historians and criminologists. Arguments against her inclusion as a Ripper victim point to the nature of her injuries. Unlike the Ripper's 5 victims, Tabram's throat was not slit, nor was she disemboweled, hallmarks of the Ripper's later crimes. These details seem to diverge from the pattern established by the killer's subsequent murders. However, evidence suggesting a possible connection lies in the nature of the assault. The killer targeted her throat and abdomen, areas that would later become the focal points for Jack the Ripper's attacks on his victims. The similarity in the targeted regions raises questions about a possible link. Given these mixed elements, it is safe to say that the jury is still out whether Martha Tabram was indeed a victim of Jack the Ripper. Her case remains intriguing and unresolved, part of the broader investigation into the Whitechapel murders. We move into more certain territory with the murder of Mary Nichols on the 31st of August, 1888. Her killing marked a chilling escalation in brutality that would come to define the Jack the Ripper murders. Mary Nichols was a victim of a savage and brutal attack. The killer's modus operandi was unmistakably evident. Her throat was cut with a deep, precise incision, and her body was disemboweled, revealing a grotesque display of violence. These hallmarks, throat slashing and disembowelment, became the grim signatures of the Ripper's subsequent murders, establishing a pattern that would tragically be repeated in the attacks that followed. The brutality of Mary Nichols' murder not only set the stage for the terror that was to follow, but also cemented her place as one of the canonical 5 victims, unequivocally linked to the notorious Jack the Ripper. Her murder remains a stark reminder of the horrifying methods employed by a killer who would terrorize Whitechapel and capture the world's attention. Blessed as we are with the gift of hindsight, we can now look back on the murder of Mary Nichols and identify it as the beginning of Jack the Ripper's notorious reign of terror. However, the police at the time did not possess the luxury of such certainty. When Mary Nichols was murdered on August the 31st, 1888, the authorities were still grappling with the enormity of the situation and had no way of predicting the series of grisly crimes that would follow. At that point, the killer's pattern, throat slashing and disembowelment, had not yet fully emerged, and the full extent of the murder's brutality was not yet apparent. It was only in retrospect, as subsequent murders displayed the same horrifying signatures, that the pattern became clear. The police, initially dealing with each murder as a separate and isolated incident, struggled to connect the dots amidst the chaos and the fear gripping Whitechapel. They were thrust into a nightmarish scenario, with little understanding of the larger, more sinister pattern that would soon define the terror of Jack the Ripper. Thus, while modern analysis allows us to pinpoint Mary Nichols' murder as the catalyst for what would become a series of infamous killings, the reality for the police at the time was one of uncertainty and increasing dread, as they faced a killer whose true nature and intentions remained shrouded in mystery. Indeed, the murder of Mary Nichols was initially connected with that of Martha Tabram by the police investigating the case. Many of the officers involved in the investigation believed that Martha Tabram could have been the first victim of Jack the Ripper, extending the count of his victims to 6. The similarities in the brutality of the attacks on both women prompted this connection. Despite Martha's injuries not aligning perfectly with the later established Ripper pattern, specifically her throat was not slit and she was not disemboweled, some officers thought her murder might fit within the pattern of escalating violence that characterized Jack the Ripper crimes. As the investigation progressed and more murders occurred, the focus shifted to the 5 victims who exhibited the unmistakable hallmarks of the Ripper's signature methods. However, the connection between Tabram and Nichols remained a point of debate and concern among law enforcement at the time. The evolving understanding of the Ripper's patterns and methods led to an eventual consensus that the 5 were the definitive victims of Jack the Ripper. But the question of whether Martha was the killer's first remains an intriguing aspect of this case. In the early stages of the investigation, the police were indeed influenced by Emma Smith's claim that she had been attacked by a local gang. This led some officers to consider the possibility that the murders might be gang-related, rather than the work of a single, methodical serial killer. Emma Smith's assertion that she had been assaulted by a gang of men cast a shadow of doubt over the notion of a solitary murderer. The brutal nature of her injuries and the gang-related context seemed to suggest that the violence of Whitechapel could be part of a broader pattern of criminal activity, rather than the signature of one deranged individual. This gang theory was further fueled by the chaotic and often violent nature of the area, where gang activity was not uncommon. In the murky environment of 19th century London, where various forms of violence were prevalent, the idea of a gang being responsible for the murders appeared plausible to investigators trying to make sense of the growing number of brutal attacks. However, as the investigation unfolded and the distinct patterns of the Ripper crimes began to emerge, it became increasingly clear that the murders were the work of a single individual. Despite this, the initial confusion and the influence of Smith's statement contributed to the complexity of the early investigations, reflecting the challenges faced by the police as they sought to uncover the true nature of the terror that had gripped Whitechapel. As a result of the confusion surrounding the nature of crimes and the influence of Emma Smith's claim, it was decided that the investigation required leadership from someone with an in-depth understanding of the East End's criminal underworld. This led to the appointment of Inspector Frederick George Abberline in early September 1888. Inspector Abberline was the ideal choice for this pivotal role. Prior to his promotion out of the area in the previous year, he had spent nearly 14 years working as a detective in the East End. His extensive experience and intimate knowledge of the district where the murders were occurring made him uniquely qualified to head the investigation. Abberline's familiarity with the local criminal landscape, coupled with his previous investigative work in Whitechapel, was seen as crucial in unravelling the complex web of violence and fear that had enveloped the area. Under his leadership, the investigation hoped to gain clearer insights into the patterns and potential motives behind the murders, as well as to leverage his connections and understanding of local criminal elements. His reintroduction to the case marked as a significant shift in the investigation, as it sought to move from confusion and uncertainty towards a more focused and informed approach to capturing the elusive killer who had terrorised Whitechapel. Abberline would go on to become one of the most pivotal figures in the investigation of the Jack the Ripper murders. It was around this time that police inquiries among the local prostitutes in Whitechapel led to the emergence of a possible suspect known as Leather Apron. This nickname was derived from his habitual attire, an apron made of leather, which he was known to wear. Leather Apron quickly became a focal point for the investigation due to the disturbing accounts from the women who frequented the area. They described him as a menacing figure who had exhibited threatening behaviour and had been involved in various incidents of harassment. The description of his apron and his violent tendencies seemed to align with the profile of someone who could potentially be linked to the brutal murders. This suspect initially attracted significant attention from the police, as the name Leather Apron begins to circulate in connection with the case. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that while he was indeed a person of interest, there was insufficient evidence to definitely link him to the murders. Despite the early lead, the search for Jack the Ripper continued, and Leather Apron was eventually dismissed as the primary suspect, as the police focused their efforts on other leads and theories. According to the accounts from local prostitutes, Leather Apron was involved in running an extortion racket among them. He allegedly threatened to rip them open if they did not hand over their money, which seemed to align with the violent nature of the murders plaguing Whitechapel. Against this backdrop of heightened tension and mounting fears, the investigation into the Whitechapel murders took a grim turn on the 8th of September 1888. On this date, the body of another prostitute was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, located less than a mile from Bucks Row, where the previous murder of Mary Nichols had occurred just a week earlier. The victim, Annie Chapman, was brutally murdered, her body bearing the horrific marks of Jack the Ripper's signature methods. She had been killed in a similarly savage manner to Nichols, with her throat slashed and her body extensively mutilated. The discovery of her body confirmed the Ripper's reign of terror was far from over, and the killer's brutal pattern was going to continue. The proximity of Annie Chapman's murder to Mary Nichols' crime scene intensified the sense of urgency among the police and public. The similarities between the two murders underscored the disturbing consistency in the Ripper's methods, reinforcing the fear and panic that had gripped the area. The discovery of Annie Chapman's body on the 8th of September 1888 marked a disturbing escalation in violence in the Whitechapel murders. Chapman, a prostitute like Mary Nichols, had been brutally slain in a manner consistent with the Ripper's previous attacks. However, this time, the violence was more extreme. The killer had removed her womb in an act that added a chilling layer of brutality to the crime. The murder scene also revealed a freshly washed leather apron found near Chapman's body. This apron, reminiscent of the one worn by the earlier suspect known as Leather Apron, drew immediate and sensationalized connections in the press. The newspapers, already embroiled in a frenzy of sensationalism and speculation, focused heavily on the apron and its potential link to the suspect. The focus on race and ethnicity in the media not only derailed the investigation, but also contributed to a period of significant social upheaval, further complicating efforts to address the terror that was gripping Whitechapel. In response to the escalating unrest and mounting pressure to control the situation, the authorities took decisive action by flooding Whitechapel with a large number of police officers. This heavy police presence aimed to restore order and address the growing public concern following the murder of Annie Chapman. The immediate effect of this influx of law enforcement was twofold. Firstly, it helped quell the agitation and racial unrest that had surged in the wake of the press's sensationalist coverage and the rising tensions within the community. The increased police visibility provided a sense of security and control, calming the fear of both residents and the local Jewish population who had been unfairly targeted. Secondly, the heightened police presence had a tangible impact on the criminal activities in the area. The intensified patrols and surveillance made it more challenging for the Ripper to operate freely. As a result, there was a notable absence of further murders for several weeks. This temporary respite suggested that the killer might have been deterred or forced into hiding due to the increased scrutiny and police activity. The strategy of overwhelming the area with police officers, while effective in restoring a degree of calm and temporarily impeding the Ripper's activities, was ultimately a short-term measure. The underlying challenges of the investigation and the persistent threat of the Ripper remained. But for a brief period, the increased law enforcement presence succeeded in stabilising the situation and preventing further bloodshed. Shortly after the murder of Annie Chapman, the police intensified their efforts to capture a suspect, leading Sergeant William Thick to arrest a local man named John Pfizer. Pfizer had come under suspicion because he was known in the area by the nickname Leather Apron, which had been linked to the extortion racket mentioned by the local prostitutes. Pfizer's arrest was a significant development, as he was believed to be a potential link to the series of murders plaguing Whitechapel. However, Pfizer's detention was short-lived. He was able to provide solid and verifiable alibis for the times of the most recent murders, including that of Annie Chapman. His alibis were corroborated by multiple witnesses and evidence, effectively clearing him of any involvement in the crimes. Despite the initial suspicion and the connection to the Leather Apron moniker, the alibis provided by Pfizer demonstrated that he could not have been the killer. His release from custody marked a setback for the investigation, as the police had to continue their search for the elusive Ripper without the benefit of a confirmed suspect. To further clear his name, Pfizer appeared at the inquest into Annie Chapman's death. During the proceedings, he was officially and publicly cleared of any involvement in the murders. The inquest, which aimed to investigate the circumstances surrounding Chapman's death, found no evidence linking Pfizer to the crime. His appearance at the inquest and the subsequent public clearing of his name helped to alleviate some of the pressure on the investigation. However, it also underscored the difficulty of the case, as the authorities were still left without a definitive suspect and had to continue their search for the elusive killer amid mounting public scrutiny and fear. During the inquest into Annie Chapman's murder, the divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, provided crucial insights into the nature of the crime. Dr. Phillips expressed the opinion that Annie Chapman had been murdered specifically to obtain her womb. He detailed the gruesome fact that the removal of the organ appeared to be the central motive for the killer, indicating a macabre and potential ritualistic element of the crime. Dr. Phillips also noted the skill and precision with which the womb had been removed. He suggested that the murderer's proficiency in this aspect of the attack implied a level of anatomical knowledge. This observation pointed to the possibility that the killer had some familiarity with human anatomy, which could have been gained through medical training, surgical experience, or other forms of anatomical study. During the summing up of the inquest into Annie Chapman's murder, Coroner Wayne Baxter made a startling revelation that sent shockwaves through the proceedings. Baxter disclosed that he had been approached by the sub-curator of a pathological museum at one of London's medical schools. The sub-curator had shared an unsettling piece of information containing a certain American doctor. According to Baxter, the American doctor had offered £20 for each womb that could be procured for him. This revelation was sensational, suggesting a possible connection between the murders and the macabre interest of obtaining human organs. The offer of money for a specific body part raised troubling questions about the motives behind the murders, and whether they could be linked to more sinister or systematic purpose. This theory induced the disturbing and macabre twist to the investigation. Baxter's musings suggested that the motive behind the murder may not be solely rooted in violence or psychological pathology, but could involve a perverse and financial motivated scheme. The possibility that the Ripper could be driven by a desire to fulfill a grotesque commercial transaction added a layer of bizarre intrigue to an already complex and horrifying case. The medical profession swiftly responded to Coroner Wayne Baxter's sensational allegations, working diligently to disprove the notion that the doctor had offered the money for the human wombs and that this could have incited the murders. In the end, Baxter's sensational theory added a brief and intense period of speculation and drama to the case, but it did not become a lasting element of the narrative surrounding the Whitechapel murders. The authorities continued their efforts to track down Jack the Ripper, grappling with the challenges of a complex and elusive investigation that remained mired in fear and uncertainty. On the streets of Whitechapel, the police were diligently striving to bring the killer, or killers, to justice. But their efforts were met with significant criticism from the press due to their inability to apprehend the perpetrator. The media's harsh scrutiny added to the pressure on the police force, highlighting the police's growing frustration and fear. Despite the challenges, the heightened police presence in the area appeared to have a deterrent effect. By the end of September, the frequency of murders seemed to have decreased, leading many residents to hope the killing spree had finally come to an end. The visible and proactive efforts of law enforcement provided a semblance of security, and the community began to relax, cautiously optimistic that the worst was over. However, this period of relative calm was short-lived, as the brutal and unpredictable nature of the killer would soon shatter the fragile sense of peace that had settled over Whitechapel. The respite proved to be a temporary lull in the storm of violence that had gripped the area, and the true horror of Jack the Ripper's reign was far from over. On the night of the 30th of September, 1888, the Whitechapel murderer returned with vengeance, taking the lives of 2 women in less than an hour, a grim escalation that shocked the community. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. Her body was discovered by Louis Daimschutz, who was turning his pony and cart into a dark yard off Berner Street around 1 a.m. Stride's throat had been cut, but the rest of her body remained unviolated. This led the police to surmise that Daimschutz's unexpected arrival had interrupted the killer, preventing him from carrying out his full, horrific ritual of mutilation. Less than an hour later, the murderer struck again. The second victim, Catherine Eddowes, was found in Meter Square in the City of London at 1:45 a.m. Her body had been subjected to an even more brutal attack than those of Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman. In addition to the usual throat cutting and disembowelment, the killer had mutated Eddowes' face, slashing it grotesquely. He had also removed and taken away her uterus and left kidney, further evidence of his escalating depravity. These 2 murders, committed so swiftly one after the other, underscored the killer's audacity and ability to strike with brutal efficiency. The double event on what came to be known as the Night of the Double Event intensified the fear and urgency among the residents and law enforcement of Whitechapel and beyond, demonstrating that the murderer was not only cunning and elusive, but growing bolder and more ruthless. As the police pursued Jack the Ripper through the labyrinthine streets of the East End of London, they stumbled upon a tantalising clue. In the doorway on nearby Galston Street, Police Constable Alfred Long, whilst patrolling his beat, discovered a blood-stained piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. It lay anonymously in the entrance of an apartment block. In the wake of the double event, as the press sensationally dubbed the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the police decided to publicise a chilling letter that had been sent to the London news agency just days earlier. Written in red ink, the letter purported to be from the killer himself, and brazenly taunted the authorities with the claim that they won't fix me yet. The author gloatingly detailed his supposed crimes and anonymously hinted at what he planned for the next victim, signing off with the now infamous pseudonym Jack the Ripper. The release of this letter to the public had an immediate and profound impact. The name Jack the Ripper captured the imagination of both the media and the public, transforming a series of brutal and sordid murders in the East End into an international phenomenon. The moniker, with its connotations of a cunning and elusive predator, played a significant role in cementing the killer's notoriety. The Ripper's letter, coupled with the media's lurid coverage, ensured that the case transcended into the grim reality of the murders, embedding itself into the public consciousness in a way that few crimes had before. The name Jack the Ripper became synonymous with terror and mystery, contributing to the enduring fascination with the case that persists to this day. It is safe to say that part of the reason why these particular crimes were still so famous is because of the sinister name. Unfortunately, releasing the letter proved a grave mistake. The police quickly deduced that it hadn't been penned by the killer, but was in fact the work of a London journalist. Despite this revelation, the allure of the name Jack the Ripper had already taken hold of public imagination. In the aftermath, hoaxers began flooding the police with letters bearing the same or sinister signatures, claiming to be from the infamous murderer. This veritable avalanche of Jack the Ripper correspondence nearly brought the police investigation to a standstill. The flood of bogus letters created an overwhelming amount of noise, making it increasingly difficult for the authorities to sit through the false leads and focus on genuine clues. One of the most famous of these pranks arrived in mid-October 1888, addressed to Mr. George Lusk, the president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee. This chilling letter, known as the From Hell letter, contained half a kidney, which the writer claimed had been taken from one of his victims. The gruesome package fueled lurid press speculation, and the kidney sent to Mr. Lusk was indeed part of one removed from the body of Catherine Eddowes. However, the consensus among police and medical professionals was that the organ was most likely a morbid prank, perpetuated by a medical student. Despite the uproar caused by this ghastly correspondence, the entire month of October passed without a murder. This period of relative calm led the residents of Whitechapel to cautiously hope the killing spree had ended. As November began, many believed the nightmare of Jack the Ripper had finally come to an end, even though the fear and uncertainty lingered just beneath the surface. Their relief, however, was tragically premature. On the 9th of November, 1888, the mutilated body of Mary Kelly was discovered in her room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street in Spitalfields. The scene was ghastly. Her body had been violently skinned down to the bone. The mutilations were so extensive and horrific that her live-in lover, Joseph Barnett, could identify her only by her eyes and ears. Mary Kelly's murder marked a horrifying climax in a series of killings attributed to Jack the Ripper. Although it is generally believed that she was his last victim, the Whitechapel murders file contains the names of several more individuals who were murdered later. These additional cases have sparked ongoing debates among historians and crime enthusiasts about whether the Ripper's reign of terror truly ended with Mary Kelly, or if his bloody spree continued under different circumstances and methods. The lingering uncertainty about the true extent of Jack the Ripper's crimes, combined with the sheer brutality of Mary Kelly's murder, ensures that the shadow of the Ripper looms large over the history of London's East End. On July the 17th, 1889, the body of Alice Mackenzie was discovered off Castle Alley, off Whitechapel High Street. She had suffered 2 stab wounds to her throat, and a long, though not excessively deep, wound extended from her left breast to her navel. Her lower abdomen also bore shallow wounds and scratches. At the time, the discovery led some police officers and doctors to speculate that Jack the Ripper had returned. However, the general consensus both then and now among experts is that Alice Mackenzie was not a victim of the Ripper. Despite similarities in the violence inflicted upon her, the nature and extent of her injuries did not align with the Ripper's established pattern, suggesting that her murder was the work of another perpetrator. On the 10th of September, 1889, the mutilated torso of an unidentified woman was discovered beneath the railway arch in Pitchin Street, not far from Commercial Road and a short distance from Berner Street, where Elizabeth Stride had been murdered nearly a year earlier. The grisly find was marked by an extensive mutilation, sparking immediate comparisons in the press to the injuries inflicted on the Ripper's known victims. Despite the initial media frenzy and speculation linking the case to Jack the Ripper, Metropolitan Police Commissioner James Monroe was quick to distance the crime from the notorious killer. Monroe assessed the patterns and concluded that the manner of mutilation differed significantly from the patterns associated with Jack the Ripper. Consequently, the unidentified woman was ruled out as one of Ripper's victims, and the investigation into her murder pursued independently. The incident highlighted the continuing public fascination with Jack the Ripper and the media's tendency to draw connections where none might exist, as well as the challenges faced by the police in distinguishing between the work of a single notorious killer and other violent crimes in the area. The final name to appear on the Whitechapel murders file is that of Frances Coles. Her body was discovered at 2:20 a.m. on February the 13th, 1891, in Swallow Gardens off Mansell Street, not far from the Tower of London. Frances Coles had been brutally attacked. Her throat was slashed, but she had not suffered any additional mutilations. The circumstances of her murder led to speculation that she might have been a victim of Jack the Ripper. Notably, Frances Cole was still alive when the police constable Ernest Thompson found her, which suggested the killer may have been interrupted before completing the crime, similar to the case of Elizabeth Stride. Despite the similarities, Frances Cole's murder did not convincingly fit the pattern established by the previous victims. The absence of extensive mutilation and the fact that she was still alive when discovered raised doubts about her inclusion in the Ripper's list of victims. Nevertheless, her death remains part of an enduring mystery of the Whitechapel murders, contributing to the complex and unsettling legacy of Jack the Ripper. When it emerged that Frances Cole had spent the days leading up to her death in the company of a sailor named Thomas Sadler, the investigation took a new turn. Sadler had been involved in several drunken altercations around the time of Cole's murder, and he had sold a clasp knife shortly after her death. These factors led the police to view him as a significant suspect, not just for the murder of Frances Coles, but for the other Whitechapel murders. Despite the initial suspicions, the case against Thomas Sadler soon began to unravel. The police found that the evidence linking him to the crime was inconclusive, and the circumstances surrounding his alibi and the clasp knife did not hold up under scrutiny. As a result, Sadler was ultimately cleared of any involvement in the murders and released. Despite promising leads, the true identity of the killer remained elusive, and the Whitechapel murders continued to baffle both the police and the public. With the murder of Frances Coles on the 13th of February 1891, the string of Whitechapel murders came to a tragic close. Her death marked the end of a series of brutal and mysterious killings that had captivated the public attention and stumbled law enforcement for over 2 years. The investigation into her murder, like those before it, failed to yield any conclusive results or identify the perpetrator. Consequently, the Whitechapel murders file was closed, and the hunt for Jack the Ripper ceased, leaving behind a legacy of speculation and unanswered questions. The identity of the killer and whether they are responsible for all of the crimes attributed to Jack the Ripper remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Since the ghastly saga of Whitechapel murders ended, the enigmatic figure of Jack the Ripper has continued to captivate and haunt people around the world. The quest to uncover and identify the infamous killer has given rise to numerous theories and suspects. The most commonly known suspects include Montague Jewett, a barrister and teacher with a known interest in surgery. He was described as having exhibited signs of mental instability. His disappearance shortly after the final murders and subsequent discovery of his body led some to speculate that he was the elusive Ripper. Michael Ostrog, a Russian criminal and physician with a history of violent behaviour. Ostrog was committed to an asylum due to his homicidal tendencies. His criminal background and medical knowledge made him a candidate for the Ripper theories. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew residing in Whitechapel. Kosminski was known for his deep-seated animosity towards women, particularly prostitutes. His admission to an asylum several months after the final murder and evidence of his violent nature have kept him as a notable suspect. In addition to these, several other figures have been proposed over the years. Walter Sickert, a renowned painter. His interest in the macabre and his supposed connection to the murders have sparked speculation. His art, some believe, contains clues or reflections of the Ripper's crimes. Sir William Gull, a prominent physician. He had been implicated in various theories, including the suggestion of high-profile cover-up involving the British elite. The murder sites themselves have become a focal point for the macabre tourism industry in London, where visitors and enthusiasts explore the locations of the infamous crimes. This industry, fueled by the enduring fascination of Jack the Ripper, underscores the enduring allure of his dark chapter in history. Even today, new names and theories continue to emerge, reflecting on the persistent quest to solve one of history's most infamous mysteries. Despite extensive investigations and numerous hypotheses, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains elusive, leaving the world to ponder whether the truth will ever be uncovered. Thank you for listening.